Key West, the home of key lime pie and Ernest Hemingway. The southernmost point of the continental United States was discovered in 1521 by Ponce de Leon and named Las Martyrs, or the Martyrs, because of its notoriously difficult and dangerous passages to navigate. It was later renamed Cayo Hueso, meaning Bone Key, and became known as Key West since it was what it sounded like to English-speaking settlers. Only about 8 square miles, this small city is filled with a rich history of tales of lore, of sunken treasure from thousands of ships that have wrecked off its shores. It was once the richest city in the United States per capita when ships would run aground on the barrier reefs or when hurricanes would sink vessels to the fathoms below. Decades later, at the height of the Great Depression, Key West, the once wealthy city, declared bankruptcy. Dependent on tourism for survival, it declared a short-lived independence from the United States, forming the micronation of the Conch Republic in 1982, and started a 1-minute war, a protest to the roadblock placed by the federal government that was hurting their industry. Today, Key West is a hub for tourists from all over the world. Its eternal tropical climate is home to artisans, fishermen, sailors, and many more. Let's take a step back in time to the golden age of sail when hundreds of ships would pass by the shores of the Florida Straits each week. Back to a time when ships were wrecking at the rate of nearly 1 per week off the coastline, and when words "wreck ashore" would bring men scrambling to the docks in a race to be the first to reach the latest misfortune ship and be called the wrecking master, with hopes of getting a larger share of the profit from salvage. Let's go back to the days of the wreckers. Wrecking has been around since merchant ships began sailing the seas. Salvaging the goods and saving lives from vessels in distress could turn a nice profit and be a godsend for isolated communities. Key West has had a history of salvaging since before the Spanish colonized it. Merchant ships passing by would wreck off its shores, and the natives of the Keys would paddle out to investigate and plunder. As a Spanish colony, settlers from Cuba and Bahamas would salvage ships and take the loot back to their islands. Once Florida became a part of the United States, Key West was established as a port, and by 1823, a wrecking court had been established where all salvage had to be reported. This is where wrecking truly became a profitable enterprise for the city. A 90-foot observation tower stood overlooking the island coast where a wrecker could keep a keen eye on the reef to shout out those romanticized words that would mobilize the city. Wreck ashore. Men in wrecking boats would take on the perilous job of saving the souls aboard and salvaging the goods, and if possible, the vessels. Most wrecks, however, were spotted by wreckers that patrolled the reefs. The wrecking boats had to be solidly built, and they had to carry specialized equipment to try and stabilize the sinking ship in order to save it or keep it afloat long enough to get everyone and everything out. The job was a dangerous one, as the same storms that grounded the ships would be the ones the wreckers had to face. Many times ships were already taking on too much water, and the goal became to pull out as much as they could prior to having to use wrecking divers to bring up the cargo from the ocean floor. The most important man on the job, the wrecking master, was the first man to reach the wreck. He had the responsibility of delegating the retrieval of the salvage and working and negotiating with other wrecking captains. He had to analyze how the goods would be retrieved and if a grounded ship would run the risk of dislodging once the cargo began to be unloaded. Wrecking was the livelihood of Key West.
You will naturally inquire how we live, and the reply is very simple: in, by, and through wrecks. If we are not directly interested in the business, our support wholly comes from it. Stop that, and we cease to live. Key West Lawyer, 1838.
Of course, the assistance of the wreckers would come at a price determined by the Key West Wrecking Court that many outsiders of the Straits criticized for the exorbitant fees awarded to the salvagers. Sometimes captains of wrecked ships who were not at imminent risk of capsizing would decline the assistance of the wreckers in the hopes of floating themselves into port. Wreckers would agree, but float off a very short distance, knowing that the turning tide and the captain's unfamiliarity with the seascape would eventually lead to their assistance being needed.
The wreckers, for the name is applied indiscriminately to the vessels and their crew, endeavor to unite the practice of Christian charity towards the unfortunate with a laudable and careful regard to their own interest. Thus, they will not only do their best to get your ship off if aground, or to assist her into port if she be leaky or otherwise disabled, but their very worst to wring from you the utmost amount of salvage that your liberality will allow, or a decision of the Admiralty Court compel you to give. Putnam's Monthly, 1856.
Wreckers had a reputation as unsavory and were compared many times to pirates who preyed on the vulnerable. In reality, the population of Key West at the time was ethnically diverse, with inhabitants of many nations and races who had at one point or another either migrated or wrecked upon the city's shores. Wreckers considered themselves businessmen, and the rate of the salvage would be divided based on the jobs assigned and performed.
From all that I have heard of wreckers, I expected to see a parcel of low, dirty, pirate-looking crafts, officered and manned by a set of black-whiskered fellows who carried murder in their very looks. I was, however, very agreeably surprised to find the vessels fine large schooners, regular clippers, kept in first-rate order, and that the captains were jovial, good-humored sons of Neptune, who manifested every disposition to be polite and hospitable, to afford every facility to persons passing up and down the reef. The crews were composed of heart, well-dressed, honest-looking men. Dr. Benjamin Strobel, 1829.
Women, though not wreckers themselves, would get as much excitement as the men when a new wreck was spotted. Storehouses with salvaged china, silks, and many other goods were put up for auction and coveted by many. Wrecking, along with other maritime industries, such as turtling and fishing, contributed significantly to the growth of the city. The salvaging industry peaked during the 1850s and began to slowly decline as lighthouses and lightships were commissioned by the government to try and stop the enormous amounts of wrecks that continued to pile along the straits. This was met by resistance by many salvagers, as their livelihoods depended on those misfortune ships. In actuality, the amount of wrecks remained the same for a while, even after building of the lighthouses. There were times that it was suspected that the lighthouses were purposely misguided to cause wrecks, though it could never be proven. The wrecking industry continued in decline after the Civil War, with the construction of new lighthouses and the construction of additional railroads connecting the Gulf to other ports in the United States. The last wrecking license was closed in 1921, officially bringing an end to the golden age of Key West wrecking. 7 years later, the overseas highway would be built, connecting the southern Keys to the rest of the United States. Today, the reefs off the Florida Keys coast remain dangerous for navigating. Changing winds and landscape make it difficult to mitigate the waters, though modern technology helps. Shipwrecks are still common, and teams of modern salvagers go out and follow the example of their predecessors, saving as much as they can from those ships in peril. And what about the thousands of ships that still remain at the bottom of the ocean? Some are part of the ocean archaeological parks where divers can go explore. Others are still awaiting discovery with caches of treasure buried away, lost to the oceans of time. Men like Mel Fisher, who discovered the Etosha, and the divers who discovered the Isaac Allerton spent their lives in search of their fortune, just as the wreckers did over 100 years ago.